few months ago, my family was together for just kind of a general family celebration. I think it was maybe a birthday, and my grandpa, my paternal grandfather, came over. A little ways into this get-together, I started hearing some stories from my grandpa, and one of them I had kind of heard before, as many people will tell some of the same stories multiple times, and this time I got a little bit more detail on it, and I found the story really, really interesting and thought it was kind of narratively relevant as well. The conversation got started when my grandpa was asking questions about guns and shooting, which has been kind of a newfound hobby of my father's and mine. We were talking about some of the times that we had gone gun shooting, and I asked my grandpa if he had ever been shooting before. He told me a story that I later remembered about him going out and shooting with a friend. His friend had a revolver that he had gotten and asked my grandpa if he wanted to go shoot it because he hadn't shot a gun at that point in his life. My grandpa said, sure, why not? This is back in the 60s, 70s, so laws, rules, and regulations surrounding things like this were substantially more lax than they are now. So my grandpa and his buddy went down the block and kind of went out over a field, and as my grandpa describes it, there were some power lines hanging above, and they were kind of shooting at bottles that were on the ground in the grass and whatnot, just having fun, when they saw a couple of birds fly down and land on the power lines. And my grandpa looked up at these birds, and as he describes, he said he thought that they were so beautiful, and he heard them kind of singing, so he described them to me as songbirds. And just out of curiosity, he said he kind of aimed the gun up and just pulled the trigger just to see what would happen, not thinking that he would hit these birds. And ultimately he did. Even though it was just one shot and he wasn't really trying to, he shot one of these birds, and he said that he just had this overwhelming sense of dread come over him, that he felt so bad for having shot one of these songbirds, and he felt terrible about it. It wasn't as if these birds were some endangered species or something like that, but he just felt so deeply saddened by this. It was a story that really stuck with me, and I think that that's because it's kind of an interesting story, not one that you would hear nowadays, but also I think it speaks to some greater truths. I think it's tough to tell with stories like this, especially when it's something that happened so long ago with somebody, whether they're literally true in a scientific type of sense, or if they're more narratively true, and that maybe it speaks to something deeper, and these memories have been exaggerated in some way, or
in hindsight you look back on a memory that's based in something that actually happened, but you have a different perspective on the time, so it's almost like the whole narrative or truth behind it seems to shift.
The reason I say that I think that this story that my grandpa told me is true in a way is because I think it is most definitely narratively true. So with my grandpa, at a pretty young age, he met and started dating my grandma, and they got married at kind of a very young age. They were together for a while, and they had my dad, and as is the case actually with almost all of my grandparents, a poor relationship with alcohol was one of the things that really resulted in a severe breakdown in their marriage, and ultimately ended up in divorce. All of my grandparents were divorced, so both of my parents were children of divorces, and I think it's something that really affected them as well as my grandparents. And I think that story, to me, perhaps I'm reading too much into it, but what I really see with that story that my grandpa tells me is somebody handing something dangerous to a young person, to a young kid, that they don't fully understand, and
haven't maybe thought through the ramifications of it.
Yeah, they haven't thought through the ramifications, and things have gone fine with it up till this point, and I think one can be lulled into a false sense of security when some risk doesn't come to fruition. right? And that's what happened with my grandpa, right? They're shooting bottles, whatever. There's no problem at this point, and then he just kind of casually aims up and shoots a bird, and then he feels terrible about it. And I think, this lack of intentionality behind him shooting this bird, I think is, really kind of symbolic of how, especially at that time, and especially for my grandparents, many of my grandparents, their relationship with alcohol was. I don't think that these are people that fully grasp the potential ramifications of engaging in certain activities, and especially to the degree to which they did. And I think ultimately it resulted in this conclusion that they didn't necessarily anticipate, right? And I think it's almost even more poetic that these songbird types, these two lovebirds, these two songbirds, as my grandpa describes them, that's what ends up perishing here. It's kind of chillingly symbolic that a short time after this, my grandparents ended up getting divorced, and they were so young and happy and carefree before that, and something like alcohol, like that gun, comes in, and when it's given to someone who doesn't have that understanding, can really have severe ramifications. And I think just in general, that's one of those things where a lot of people are exposed to something like alcohol or tobacco or drugs or guns at a young age, and they're not really regulated or explained in a proper fashion to someone. And these are young people that don't have a risk reward portion of their mind that is fully mature. When people are young, they are oftentimes impulsive and take large risks for small rewards, and that's because that portion of young people's brains is not fully developed yet.
I think the other sad or kind of chilling thing with your grandpa is, even now, like, he regularly laments the loss of that marriage. I think that's the impression I get.
Yeah,
he's
definitely
still
does.
grieving over it. I mean, however many years later, decades later.
And he still blames himself as well.
Yeah, and it's just talking to him, like, he looks back with tells stories from when, they were married and when your dad was a little kid, like, very bittersweet and somberly. And it's
Yeah, he really reminisces about it.
It's really quite sad.
Yeah, I think you hear so many stories of people at a young age getting involved in something that I don't think they understand the full ramifications of. In my grandfather's case, it's alcohol. In other people's cases, it's drugs or guns or tobacco or what have you. And these can have a profound effect on somebody's life. It can destroy not only that person's life, but also the lives of other people and those around them as well.